My name is Clarissa Adams Fletcher, and I'm here to talk to you a little bit at the 2021 CCFLT Spring Language Virtual Conference, Languages from the Get-Go. From the get-go, we have always wanted to communicate. It is a human need. It is human nature to communicate our ideas in written form and in oral form. And so, what is more important than making our classes real, making our classes relevant, making our classes matter? For a long time, there were students who loved school, enjoyed it 100%. And then something happens. Why is it that after precious few years, our students don't think that what we do matters? Well, I had the pleasure of being named AGFL Teacher of the Year 10 years ago. And my platform was global competence. And so I want to ask you a question today. Do you want globally competent students? Well, of course you do. I mean, who would answer no to that? So I didn't even put that as an option. Now, I did put maybe. And I put maybe for a reason. Maybe because it's a lot of work. Maybe because it's tough. Maybe because it's challenging. And quite honestly, maybe it all is. But is it worth it? Of course it is. And that's why you're here. So I wanted just get a few things out of the way. These are the tools that I wanted to use in this. I pretty much in 2021, different from 2010, um, am using Flipgrid, Google Jamboard, Padlet, and then I have some of my older tools that I've used because I don't believe in reinventing a wheel until I absolutely have to. But just wanted to put those in so as you see those on some of the presentation screens, you'll know what references those are. The other ones would be, where do I get my information? Easy, the newspapers, the news. What's going on in the world is what should be going on in your classroom. Because if it's happening all around the world and not in your classroom, it makes your class a little less relevant. And because what we do and what we teach is what you can do, but in another language, that means whatever's happening in the world should be happening in your room or on your computer screen. Okay. So relevant questions all the time. Everything is relevant all the time. Now, the question is, how do you work it in? Sometimes we do have limitations. And so there are times where we have to make things work for us using the tools that we have. So I always ask my students at the end, and I do teach a mix of students. I teach some upper level and I teach some lower level students. I will say in the spring semester, which is the semester we are in now, I do have upper level groups. So you're going to see probably more examples from there. But in this particular one, I asked them what was the best thing that we talked about. And I have what's called temas de actualidad, or just kind of like current events. And we wrap around the vocabulary, the grammar, the themes, all of those things in that particular area. So I asked them to say in the Padlet what was interesting. You'll notice the topics from here, 2012. So that's how long I've been doing this. And the kids will always tell me that they always know what's going on in the world when they're in our class. And not only that, they can talk with their parents about it, or they can talk with their other teachers, or they can make connections with their world history or with their AP US history or etc. And isn't that what aren't those our isn't that one of our five C's? I mean, net connections. And isn't it community because it takes it out when they can talk to their parents about it? And aren't they communicating? And aren't they learning about culture? And aren't they comparing to their own culture, their own world, their own political systems? I mean, isn't that the essence of our class? So here's one little closer to home. Is bullying or is a problem at our school? So this was a topic we had, and again, the students were able to put up their their thoughts, their ideas of what they thought. Um, and when you think about bullying, we've been talking about bullying for a long time, so that's relevant. And talking about bullying, it's important to let students know that their voices can be heard. Those are the things that we look for when we're looking for topics that capture student interest. And you can see with just these little snippets of language, you can talk a lot. We can begin with, I address them with creo que, no creo que. So we can talk about grammatical parts that go with that. We can talk about different vocabulary words, synonyms, antonyms, things that help them to express themselves on a higher level, but themes or topics that are relevant. This fall, I had the pleasure of teaching a general level Spanish 2 class. And I must admit, I was challenged by it, and I still wanted to make it relevant because I think many times we might lose students who would be interested in doing language except it somehow doesn't represent them. So, of course, we have units that are put up for us by our district, especially at this level. And so I wanted to make sure that the students I included what was interesting to the students as opposed to textbook exercises that work for them. So I'm using a Google Jamboard here, and here I'm asking kids, like, so what time did you get up during the vacation? Typical question, right? But it's still personalized. It's still relevant because it's about them. So when I say relevant, it doesn't mean that it always has to be about, whoa, what's going on in the world? Yes, you get there, but you get them there by hooking them in the area in which they are comfortable. At this level, their ability to communicate linguistically is about themselves and their internal, their environment at that point. So, again, same thing. So, again, grammatically relevant. Well, our school is on a 4 by 4 block. And so in January, we start a term August to December, and then the next January, we start a new term. So there's a year's worth of knowledge that happens in that. So I found that for us to stay relevant, to keep it relevant, you spiral a lot. By spiraling a lot, you can keep the students by saying, well, remember when we talked about this in last year, and it's really only a semester, they hook it on and they realize that one thing leads to another thing leads to another. And as long as you can keep that consistency within the area, it has actually served our program a lot. I get a lot of pushback when people ask me about um, oh, doesn't it kill your program? It actually augments our program because it allows our students to see the relevance from one semester to another. And so we're very intentional about talking as a group about what are we going to talk about this semester, what can carry over to the next semester, etc. So when you talk about it keeping it grammatically relevant, the students started in January. They learned numbers, they learned to introduce themselves, and then in March, COVID hit, and all of a sudden, they were kind of on vacation. And then they were really on vacation. And then August came about, and COVID was still going on, and my kids were like, I was like, okay, I'm about to teach Spanish 2. General, I love the Spanish 2 unit, da 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 da. And I realized my students really aren't Spanish 2. My students are Spanish 1.35. So we get to the unit, we're about to talk about childhood, and they are ready to talk about comparing when were you born, and they break out with nací in 2005. And I'm like, no, I'm gonna need you to say that in Spanish. And they look at me and they go, no, I don't know how to say that. And I realize, oh my goodness, it's right, 1.35. Okay, so we stop, we take a moment. Everybody throw up your birthdays. Let's put them up here. Let's do a quick review or a quick teach. So for that moment, that's so relevant that I had all of their attention. all of their attention, even on the screen. It was great. The ones with the cameras on, the ones with the cameras off, the ones with the mics off. They managed to plop that up there and they were able to say, Yo nací en 2005. Yo nací en 2003. And they remembered because all of a sudden they realized it was not as hard as they thought it was. But it wasn't jumbled up in all of the midst of that grammar. It was relevant to that moment, that second, that one thing, and they were able to do that. And you'll see later how I use Flipgrid to reinforce that particular part, keeping it relevant. Okay. So again, this group making sure that it was relevant, it was short, it was quick. We did another one and we added some different things. So when I was a child, I woke up at. When I was, did you visit your family a lot? And it was quick, sticky notes. Pop it up, pop it up, pop it up. It kept it relevant, it kept it alive. It kept the students who had tech difficulties, they were able to write it here, or we were using Zoom. So they could, if they couldn't access the Google Jamboard because they were using their phone that day, they could write it in the chat. So they were able, but they were able to write it. They could see it formed by their classmates as well. So it was like watching it in a classroom. And that helped them a lot. And by doing it over and over and over again, they were getting that repetition that they needed, but it was relevant to their lives. All right, I'm going to jump now. And I jump now because I want to take a few minutes and talk about how you can spiral and make sure that everything stays relevant. Pick your topic and then watch it blossom. I can follow what happened in the world based on what we talked about in class. So, in this particular one, you'll notice that this was talking about el papel de la cultura, the role of culture. Wow, isn't that exactly what we're talking about? Um, the students were talking about different ideas, and this is a upper level Spanish class, but they were looking at what was going on during the Arab Spring. So the students read the article from the BBC Mundo, their point of view, a different perspective, and it allowed them to talk about that very simple language. They were able to, after a few conversations. We would have Friday conversations where we talked about the cultural events. They would read the article and summarize, and then they could pull out the vocabulary that they would need to be able to express. So that was one. Here was another where we discussed Ebola. Remember Ebola? Remember when we thought that was a big deal? Remember when we thought the world might end because there was man with Ebola? Wow, those were the days, I guess. Well, anyway, again, the students were able to talk about Ebola. We could use the infograph. They talked about how it worked and they could see the comparisons between what was happening here and how it was being reported in different areas. And you'll notice the themes, science and technology. All right. You'll notice in the one before, global challenges. So here again, I'm sneaking in the AP themes before they realize, and I'm not sneaking them in, I tell them what they are. But in that particular way, they are able to keep it relevant. This is really happening in the world. Not only is it happening in the world, but they also know, this is going to be useful later. Remember, I talked about my Schoolopoly kids. So the Schoolopoly kids know why they're doing it. They know they have to do the homework. They want to know how it fits in their grade. And so the combination of the two keeps it moving. So it's a double-edged sword because on one hand, you have students that know how to do school, know what to do to play school, but they aren't necessarily bought into school because for them it's all a game. And on the other hand, you have the students that are well, they may know how to play school, but they don't really want to play school, and their grades matter, but they don't may not matter as much. Um, and so they aren't bought in because they don't think that what you're doing in school matters. So again, if you marry these two concepts and keep your areas, keep your material relevant, one group knows what to do or how to do it if they don't want to do it. Then you have another group that's set up and ready to go, but they just want to play the game, but you hook them by the topic, you get a lot of buy-in from there. Okay. So again, temas de actualidad. So for example, one of my spirals is that the students in this unit in this year begin with a unit on Argentina, and we talk about they have time just to kind of look at what would interest them about Argentina. And then, of course, we have the historical figures. We talk about those items. Well, one of the famous people that they discuss is Kino. And if you know who Kino is the creator of Mafalda. And the students will go through and learn something about Mafalda. They will present and they will go on. And we vary how we do it in different ways. But this year, of course, unfortunately, Kino, the author, died. And so it came up as a recurring theme. It comes up as a recurring theme anyway in AP, but it came up again, obviously, when he passed. And my students were like, "Oh, is this the same guy that we talked about in?" Yes. Well, the students then were able to. They did a couple of readings, and they watched the video of how Kino was mourned in Argentina, and how many people discussed how they learned how to read via Mafalda. And all of a sudden, light bulbs go off, because now it's not just, even though they're playing Schoolopoly, so they did what they had to do, they realized that this is a real person, this has affected real people, and then I have them compare to with whom would you compare in the United States. And so the students are like, oh, well, it could be Peanuts, it could be Dilbert, it could be Garfield, it could be, and all of a sudden they make a personal connection. So those are the things or reasons why it is important, it is imperative to me to keep your class relevant, because then your students are actually getting a lot more. All right, to have an impact, again, Dia de Muertos, topic that is talked about all the time. Okay, but how do you jazz it up? So I had my students do, as you can see, this is a series of listening exercises. And so the first one was Dia de Muertos versión pandémica. And so I had the students look, it was a infograph and a picture rather, and it had a picture of the calavera or the skull, but he had a mask on. And so I had the students talk about it. I had students talk about in both my Spanish 2 class and in my AP class. And they talked about what did they see, and all of a sudden they learned the vocabulary words that they needed to discuss it. And of course, they realized that they already know that this has affected the world. But it's different when all of a sudden every part of what they're looking at is being affected. So the second one evokes emotion with a short about well, sorry, is the second one. This one had three parts. So they talked about emotion because it was a short film about family and with Dia de Muertos. So I'm yeah, grabbing them a little bit more. And they have authors through music, and the music are people that they heard the year before singing about Dia de Muertos, but they're not Mexican. So all of a sudden, again, we're linking and we're connecting and bringing them full circle. And then you'll notice too, I have in bold because they went on a virtual visit. So they were set up to be able to visit the museum because it was closed. They offered virtual visits, which allowed my students to participate fully in the particular in the action. And so that helped them. And then the last part is Jose Guadalupe Posada, who is a famous artist who is famous for his etchings of La Catrina, who is one of the people who is featured in a lot of the artwork from Dia de Muertos. That led to a conversation about cultural assimilation, cultural appropriation, um, how much they see on TV, where they see this, and where does that take us? And then that takes us to alienation and assimilation. And so each part leads to another piece, which leads to another piece, which leads to another part, which reinforces what is going on. So, how did we get to the coronavirus? All right. So remember I told you that it was January, and then it was March. And I told you I start with my temas de actualidad. And the students' first one, temas de actualidad, out the window. Of course, again, I told you we talked about Ebola. So when coronavirus popped up, I said, oh, this is ciencia y tecnología, science and technology. Global. I'm not even thinking global challenges. I'm just thinking science and technology. So put it up, little first thing, little virus, let's talk about it. If you look at the image, this was from January 2020. You'll see the date there. Um, you see that mask on the man? See the man taking the temperature? They start off simple summary, little vocabulary. The words there, difundir, which is to spread, transmitir, transmit. Okay, so they're having the words to be able to just talk about coronavirus. And they're all, wow, okay. Well, so then coronavirus became the next level coronavirus steps. They're going to do a PSA, public service announcement for coronavirus. So the students have a 1 minute PSA that they set up, they do on their phones. They record and what do we get to do in this? Well, of course we get to reinforce commands. So you get to do the all of the exact same things that you would do in your course, but you use relevant material. Now, obviously this was last year this time. I ended up using the commands and some of the information that I found on Twitter or different sites like that to show my Spanish 2 students when I was teaching them that particular section, and they gave advice based on um, that information. And so it becomes full circle and doesn't, I told you, I said maybe it may be a lot of work. It may be, but a lot of times if you plan it strategically, a lot of the information works. So we get to the third part of coronavirus. So now this is January. Well, now we've been at home and the students have done a little course. So now we don't. I mean, now everybody else is talking about coronavirus. Well, my kids are like, we've summarized coronavirus. We've done a PSA on coronavirus. How much more can we do with coronavirus? Well, let's look and see how the rest of the world is dealing with coronavirus. Because, of course, by now, we're like, well, we knew a lot, but we didn't think we were going to need to know all of this. So we did a meme challenge, and the students were able to put up memes and see how they were shown in coronavirus. Okay, I'm going to roll us back again. Remember, I talked about Mafalda, right? Mafalda's Argentina. We got to the end of coronavirus, and the students had to pull up. Um, well, we had to change how we normally would do it. We would create a Google site. The students would put all their ideas together. And this time, the students had to talk about different areas that were represented the different themes and what they had learned and what it meant to them. So the students did this particular one was on public and private identities. And the public and private identities allowed the students to, well, this student chose to talk about the disappeared because after we did Los Desaparecidos in Argentina, the Dirty War, and that whole unit, I also found information and I showed the students about the young men and young women who are now finding their grandmothers. And again, the students are like, okay, this is like relevant. And then we talk about how some kids were being kidnapped. And they didn't realize until years later that the people that were raising them were not the people that they thought. And all of a sudden, again, the students are linking the ideas. So you got to think about how you're going to do it on those particular ones. So I'm going to change for a minute, and I told you I was going to show you how I work my flip grid with my level twos. So our units were set up as I put yo, and I guess I should have put myself. Well-being, daily routine, childhood, and travel. Notice that travel is cut off because we didn't get to travel in our COVID year. Well, nobody could travel anyway, so kind of apropos the way I looked at it. So when you look at this particular section, the units, the students started off. Remember, I told you this was my my level two. That was really 1.35. So when these students started, the very first flip grid they did was one called Kinsoy. Who am I? And the students talked about they were supposed to introduce themselves. And that's when I realized that my students really couldn't talk. And you're going to see a plethora of flip grid opportunities. Why? Because I slowed down. What was relevant for my students at that point was to be able to capture those items. So instead of doing maybe one a week, we did one a day. But we weren't trying to do 45 seconds, a minute and 15 seconds. No, we were doing 30 seconds. Or actually, we started off with the first time I said, I just want to hear what you can do. The first presentation that they did was 8 seconds long. That was all they could say. And I realized, wow, we have a lot to do. So we got a lot to be make it relevant. So the students began to really, so each day we would do it and then I would have them go back and redo it and then go back and redo it, but not go back and redo the exact same one. We would add a piece on. So each one would start with hello, my name is blah, blah, blah. I am so many years old. I am from blah, 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 and I live here and I like to do blah. So that was our starting point. And then each time as we added on, it became a different kind of introduction, but with basically the same material. They got very comfortable with that information, and that helped them to understand that it was relevant to keep practicing because if I said to them they had to do 45 seconds or they had to do a minute, at the beginning they just looked at me and shook their heads. And then after they shook their head, we kept adding on, they were able to retain more information. They were able to retain more information because they were no longer trying to memorize everything or read off of a piece of paper. And I found that um, these are the tricks that allow your classes to become more relevant because your students come into language to speak the language. Well, the only way to speak the language is to retain what they're learning. The only way they can retain the language is if you make it relevant and you make it stick. The only way to make it stick is to make them hook. And you make it hook, and you continue that same process. And so by the end of the semester, my students were able to, they can, um, they could introduce themselves. They could talk about their childhood. I mean, not, I won't pull the wool over your eyes and say that they were perfect or that they were able to talk perfectly, distinguishing between imperfect and preterite. No, no, no. They could talk about their childhood. So they could give me snippets. They had errors, yes, but they were well on the way of being able to talk about healthy life, talk about well-being, what they did to maintain their daily routine. Was their daily routine different now versus when last year before COVID hit? And those where they were focused on trying to communicate, not so much perfectly, but trying to communicate. And then by being able to communicate, they were able to discuss more items. So listening exercises, helpful, all kinds of ways. I threw this one in here just to show you from, remember when Scotland was voting? That was a long time ago. So these items are things that change. So I want to say, when I say keep it relevant, you want to spiral, but understand that within your spiral, there's going to be an outlier every single time because next year, obviously, it will spiral, but hopefully it won't be a whole coronavirus life, and that will dictate your exercises, your how you approach different things. Because I thought about it when I first said, I said we're all gonna be sick of talking about COVID. Well, COVID has sort of consumed us. And if you don't recognize that COVID consumed us, then your class probably wasn't as relevant. Now, did we escape from COVID? Heck yeah, because there was a point where we were like, okay, we're COVID dead. But, that's the way it worked. So, what else did we do? All right. So, again, we had the listening exercises, relevance, exposure, listening, 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 listening. So, I had my students, we were talking about personal and public identities, and we saw Renata Flores, and Renata Flores is a young lady who is singing Quechua using Cardi B. So again, you got to have the relevance. And so the students were like, oh, I'll never forget Renata Flores just because of her connection. And those are the things that you always want to do. You want to be conscientious about your audience, and how they relate to the topic. Okay. So I decided that this year I was duty bound to really, really investigate the Afro diaspora. And my students I have a class of three quarters non native, a quarter native speakers. And my native speakers to a T made the statement to me that they did not realize that there were Afro Mexicans, or we did a unit on Palenque and they're Afro Colombian. Well, they knew they were Afro Colombians, but not the Palenque section and how that worked. But different ways of helping everyone relate, be relevant, and think about how everything should work. So when you are trying to create a course that is relevant to your students, you need to look at who your students are. You need to look at what your students, how your students have been exposed. And just because they have not been exposed does not mean that they should not be exposed. And in fact, that might make your course more relevant than ever. It will allow students to be open-minded to all kinds of areas. And if we as world language teachers are not the ones that are opening those doors and opening those windows and opening all of that to our students, then we are doing our students a disservice. So the last part I want to talk about are our final reflections. And I do this in all of my upper level classes. And because I told you that we have a 4x4 block schedule, we end our AP semester in the fall. So it doesn't make sense to me to give a final exam in the fall, because the student's final exam is the AP exam, which does not occur until May or spring. However, it gives me an opportunity to allow my students to personalize the curriculum yet again, and for them to take a moment, take a pause, and realize how far they have come. And the relevance that has kept them going is what opens up for them the idea that they will be global citizens because they have learned so much. So we take the modes: interpersonal, interpretive, and presentational. And I asked the students to pull out different things from each during the course that would represent their growth in each of the three modes. I picked this one on purpose because it was 2015. I've been doing these for a while, and I'm going to show you the difference between how I had to do it this year and how I've done it in the past. Obviously, this year was a truncated semester. We had abbreviated classes. We didn't have our full 90 minutes. We had a 60-minute um, our 60-minute class. So those things affected what kinds of things I could ask my students to do. But if you'll notice that they had to go through and justify their growth in each of the areas. This forced, guess I want to use that word, encouraged students to look at all of their different areas and look at what they had done. So, for example, I'm going to click here. Google Voice. I listed Google Voice as one of the things that I had used before. I don't use Google Voice quite as much now. Flipgrid is just a little more friendly, and my Google account was getting full. But Google Voice allowed me at that point, at that time, to give the students, and you can do the same thing because you still have, you saw my list of Flipgrids. The students had a Google Voice about every 3 weeks beginning in August. And we're in the last one I would usually run about the end of November. The students never got to hear those back. They could hear their, obviously, their conversations. They practiced that. They could listen to each other. They could listen to that if they had other presentations. But they would never hear their Google Voices until the end of the semester. I would send their Google Voices back to them with whatever they would have gotten their commentary during the semester, but they wouldn't get the actual Google Voice back. But so they would get to listen to their Google Voice, and they would listen to their growth from August to November. And they were always just kind of blown away at how much better they sounded in November than August. Now, some of them would say that they would peak somewhere about the second, third week of October, and then they sort of plateaued, which is natural. Our students take the AP exam as juniors, and as juniors, I've recognized that by first week of November, our students are really struggling to finish out that semester strong. So they do hit a peak and then they plateau. And that's really why it's important for them to have those final reflections, because they kind of think that they haven't made progress. And then they take a minute, they have to go back and justify their growth. And they realize, wow, there's a lot of growth there. Okay, I'm going to jump here for a minute and I want to show you this one. So this was the one I did this year. So obviously their final was done a little differently. They did a recording of their reflections and thoughts on how they've grown, and they should include the three modes: interpretive, interpersonal, and presentational. And they had to talk 9 minutes. So they did a one-on-one conversation with me. They signed up on Zoom for a specific amount of time, and they would talk to me about how they'd grown in each area, and what, most importantly, how much, what else they needed to do. Okay, so what did they still have time, they still have opportunities from now till May to increase their proficiency. However, they now had the wind at their back, because all of a sudden they're like, well, if I was able to do this from August to December, what can I do from January to May? Well, I mean, they're not going to probably make that much growth in that case, but they at least are still in line to continue growing on that particular part. And that's important, because for me, as I said, I want to create globally competent citizens. And if that means that they just need a push to stop for a minute and realize that they have gotten where they need to be, that's powerful. So that's the AP part. So I know you're dying to know what happened with my Spanish 2 students. So this is what happened. Their Spanish 2 final, notice it had COVID, childhood, routine, bienestar. So they got to talk about different parts, all right? And I couched it, I made it relevant because they could do a couple of different ones, because some of them needed some points. Well, COVID was COVID, and some of them struggled with maintaining their enthusiasm in Zoom, no matter how relevant I could make it. But they could talk about different aspects. And so um, it was interesting that the parts we practiced the most obviously sounded the best. But when the students started doing reach, they were really good at trying to keep it personalized, but still sound like a 3-year-old, because that was our goal. Like, you sound like a 3-year-old. Don't try to sound like a 15-year-old yet. The time is coming. So I would like to close. Well, I'm going the wrong way. I would like to close by talking about this particular scene. And obviously, this was not 2020. This was a couple of years ago. The student that is on the screen was a former student. And these obviously were current students at the time. These are now former. Everybody's former now. But this student here studied with me. She ended up marrying a young man and moving to Colombia. She moved to Colombia and started a business. a leather business. And she Skyped in with my class. And they asked her all kinds of questions. They asked her questions like, well, how did you learn Spanish? Blah, 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 blah. And her response was simply, oh, well, yeah, I sat in the desk just like you did. And we talked about different things and it piqued my interest and I started to travel and blah, 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 blah. So I'm excited that I have three students who are right now studying, well, not studying, they're teaching in Spain because their interest was piqued sitting in the classroom talking to another student, et cetera, et cetera. Well, her leather company or the company that she and her husband started was with the locals, and the idea was sustainability. So we were doing a unit on sustainability, and her business popped up as well. It didn't pop up. I mean, I knew she was doing it. So I contacted her and asked her, would she be willing to talk with the students about it? And the students all of a sudden, it's not a textbook, it's not exercises. It's not even their teacher. It's another student, quote unquote, at that point who has lived in their neighborhood, sat in the same desk, had some of the same experiences, and all of a sudden it's something real for them. Another one of the students was a photographer who got a grant to do this in Bolivia, and she Skyped in and the students had an opportunity to talk to about that. But if that becomes a part of who you are as an educator, to truly educate, um, no matter what, that's how you keep it real. And that's how you make your classes matter. And while I've been doing this for almost 30 years now, and there are times where it is tiring, I can I can tell you for sure that there's not a time that happens when a student reaches out to me and tells me that, and I know everybody has the same experience. They reach out to you and they tell you that you made a difference in their life, that da 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 da. That's the best thing ever. I mean, I don't want cake. I don't want a gift. I don't want a gift card. I don't want a Starbucks card. I want to know that I made a difference in your life, in how you look at the world, and that it is up to us to make sure that we continue this journey forward. So, all I want to tell you is I started my class or started my teaching career with a principal who said to me, if you're teaching the same way this year as you were teaching 5 years ago, now I've shown you examples. Obviously, they're still similar ideas, but not teaching the exact same way. You have to be willing to keep it relevant, challenge yourself, because the world is changing so quickly that whatever you did 5 years ago, 2 years ago, is not going to work the same way. So I encourage you, in fact, I challenge you to keep it real, keep it relevant. Thank you for your time, and I hope you got a lot out of it.